Welcome to Dr. Warrick's podcast channel. Warrick is a practicing cardiologist and author with a passion for improving care by helping patients understand their heart health through education. Warrick believes educated patients get the best health care. Discover and understand the latest approaches and technology in heart care and how this might apply to you or someone you love.
Hi, my name's Dr. Warrick Bishop, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast and videocast station. And today I'd like to cover a topic which, to be honest, is a little bit complicated, but I think it's really important, and I would really like to try and cover it because I think if I can educate you with some of the language we use around this particular topic, which is fats, oils and lipids, then it will be really beneficial down the line when we talk in more detail about aspects not only of nutrition, of storage, but also of therapy. So, here we go. I'm going to be talking about hydrocarbons, fats, oils, and lipids. Hold on tight to your seat. First of all, what's a hydrocarbon? Well, the name, to some degree, gives it away. Hydro, standing for hydrogen. Carbon, standing for, you guessed it, carbon. Now, we all know what hydrogen is. It's one of those gases that makes up the sun. It was one of the building blocks of our universe. So we know of hydrogen. We've heard of it. We also know what carbon is, because when we burn trees, organic matter, when we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide. That's a byproduct of the process of combustion, carbon dioxide. So carbon to do with organic matter, hydrogen, a gas that is really universal. So a hydrocarbon is made up of hydrogen atoms and carbon atoms. What I'd like to do is explain those in a little bit more detail, and to do that, I'm going to ask you to imagine a metaphor to help me explain it. I would like you to imagine carbon as a child. We're going to use C as the defining letter for carbon atoms, C. So imagine C, a little circle with a C in it, that's our child. Now, these particular children are very unusual. These children that I'm going to be talking about have 4 arms. And these particular children always have to have something in each of those arms. They can't have an arm waving around loose. Now, we're going to use H for hula hoop, but H is also going to mean hydrogen atom. So when we think of a circle with a C in it, there's our child. Think of it with 4 arms coming out at equal positions around the body, and let's put a hula hoop in each of those arms of that child. So now we've got a C in the middle, one child, our unusual child with 4 arms, who's holding 4 hula hoops. Well, that gives us a structure which really is the most simple of hydrocarbons. That most simple of hydrocarbons is holding as many hydrogen atoms for the number of carbons that it's got. And we call that saturated. It is saturated for the number of carbon atoms, i.e. it's holding the most number of hula hoops it possibly can. So we would call that, if we were going to be organic chemists, we would call that a saturated single hydrocarbon. Interestingly, if you are curious, that particular hydrocarbon with 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms is called methane. Don't need to remember that, but if it ever comes up in a Trivial Pursuit question, you've got the answer. Now imagine we want to create chains of children. We want to take our classroom of children. Let's imagine we've got a kindergarten class full of children, all with 4 arms, so they're very busy. But now we're going to take 2 children and take them out of the class and join those 2 children together. Now, we can join those children, one child holding the other child, each using a single arm. And therefore, each of those children would have 3 free arms to be holding hula hoops. Now, what I'm going to ask you to imagine is that each of our children drop one of their hula hoops and use their free arm to grab the other child. Now, while you imagine that, there's 2 children face to face with 2 arms reaching to each other, holding each other's hands, and they've got their 2 spare arms, each holding a hula hoop. So this time, we've got a chain of carbon atoms. It's a chain of only 2. But this time we've got 2 hands, 2 arms holding the children together. We would call this a double bond. A double bond. And this particular situation, where now the children are only holding 4 hydrogen atoms, is no longer saturated because they've dropped 2 of their hydrogen or 2 of their hula hoops. So this is now an unsaturated carbon chain. Do you get it? So saturated means that really the children are holding as many hula hoops as they possibly can based on the number of arms they've got. An unsaturated hydrocarbon means that the children are not holding as many hydrogens as they possibly can because they're busy holding onto each other with more than one hand. Children can even hold each other with 3 of their 4 hands in our particular group. So imagine that. So a child holding another child, each extending 3 arms to each other and with their spare arm holding a hydrogen atom. This is definitely an unsaturated chain. In the setting of a double bond where 2 children are holding each other with 2 hands and they're holding 4 hula hoops between them, we call that ethylene. And in the situation where we've got 2 children holding each other with 3 hands and with their spare hand they're each holding 1 hydrogen, the technical name for that is actually acetylene. You don't need to know that, but it's sort of interesting because it puts a name to some of the things that we've routinely heard about in our daily lives. So hydrocarbons are simply compounds, molecules, made up of hydrogen and carbon only. And in fact, they form the basis of what we use for fuel and petrol and so forth. In the analogy, in the metaphor I want to use, we're going to think of children as our carbon atom with 4 arms and our hydrogen atom as hula hoops. So children holding hula hoops, which is a pretty easy thing to imagine. Now, our hydrocarbons, our children, as you can imagine, we can stack them up in a chain. One holding the next, holding the next, holding the next, with their spare arms being used for hula hoops. But we can also take children, and you've probably done this when you were a child yourself, and formed rings. Children can be organised in rings, children can be organised in chains. And with multiple children, multiple hydrogen atoms, we've got multiple different hydrocarbons. Now, keep with me. We've now got hydrocarbons, but I want to get to fats and oils. How does that happen? Well, we need to add something in because we're now going to go from hydrocarbons, which are simply made from hydrogen and carbon, and we're going to go to a different class of compound. To our hydrocarbon, we're going to add another atom. And the atom we're going to add is oxygen. For the sake of our metaphor, we're going to use the letter O, and our O is going to stand for an orange ribbon. So now we've got children with 4 arms holding hula hoops, and we're now going to throw O, which is going to represent oxygen, but we're going to call it an orange ribbon, into the mix. Now, if we take a chain of children of any length, let's say 5 or 6 children, and we line them all up together in a chain formation, and with the last child in that chain, we take away their 3 hula hoops, and in one hand we give them a hula hoop, but we wrap an orange ribbon around that hula hoop. So now they're holding a H for hula hoop, O for orange in the same hand. And in the other 2 spare hands, we get them to hold an orange ribbon with 2 hands. So can you picture that? We've got that chain of children, our very last child, with their 3 hands, we swap a hula hoop for a hula hoop with an orange ribbon around it. And then we get the child to drop 2 hula hoops, and with those 2 free hands, pick up an orange ribbon with those 2 hands. By doing that, by adding oxygen into the chain of hydrocarbon, into that chain of children with a double bond to the oxygen and a single bond to the hydrogen-oxygen mix, which we call a hydroxyl group, we've now turned that chain of hydrocarbons into a fatty acid. A fatty acid. And that's to do with the way the chemical reacts. So we've now created fatty acids from our hydrocarbons. Remember, I said we can also arrange children in rings. So let's now imagine our rings of children, maybe 2 rings of 6 children, side by side, holding each other. And on one of those rings, one of the extreme children, we take a hydrogen away, we take a hula hoop away, and we give them a hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it back. We give them a HO back, a hula hoop and oxygen, a hula hoop and orange ribbon together back. That HO is a hydroxyl group, and we've just turned those rings of children, in chemical speak, into an alcohol. Which sounds pretty interesting and a fascinating thing to do with children, but I hope you've got it. We've gone from hydrocarbons, which can be chains or rings, and now we've added oxygen or oxygen and hydrogen together in the chain forms to make fatty acids, or we've added a hydroxyl group, which is oxygen and hydrogen together, a hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it, to the ring forms, and we've made a ring alcohol formation. Well, I hope you continue to follow that. So, we're going to talk about our fatty acids, and I've already touched on this concept of saturation. So if we've got a fatty acid where the children-to-children bonds are 1 arm to 1 arm, 1 arm to 1 arm, 1 arm to 1 arm, and those children are all holding as many hula hoops as possible, except for the very last child, who, remember, is holding an orange ribbon with 2 hands and a hula hoop with an orange ribbon wrapped around it with 1 hand, then if we've got single child-to-child hand-holding, single carbon-to-carbon bonds, we've got a saturated fatty acid. If in that chain of children, somewhere in that chain, and it doesn't matter where, 2 of the children who are adjacent decide to let go of their hula hoops and with their spare hands grab each other, then we've got a double bond or a double handhold occurring. And that double handhold, that double bond, means we are no longer saturated because the fatty acid chain, the child chain, is no longer holding as many hula hoops as it can. It's no longer holding as many hydrogen atoms in it as it can, it is now an unsaturated fatty acid. These are words you will have heard, and I'm discussing this because I'm really keen for you to understand it. It's important that you recognise where some of this terminology comes from. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I want you to know what some of these words mean. So that's unsaturated, and because it's only occurred between two children, i.e. there's only one double handhold, one double bond, we're going to call that a 1 unsaturated fatty acid. A 1 unsaturated fatty acid. What's another word for 1 in sort of scientific speak? Mono. Single. Mono. So we can call it a mono unsaturated fatty acid. One double bond occurring in that fatty acid chain. You've probably guessed it by now, but if more than one pair of children decide to hold hands, we have a poly unsaturated fatty acid. Poly meaning more than one. Okay, hopefully pretty straightforward, not too complicated at this stage. I'm going to digress very quickly because at the moment when we think about our children holding hands with a double bond, we're thinking of their arms reaching out side by side, parallel, straight, the right arm of one child, if you like, reaching the left arm of the other child, and really these arms are running parallel. Well, we would call that a normal or natural bond in chemistry, and I just want you to know this. So the normal bond between carbon atoms is called a cis, C-I-S, cis bond, and that's the normal bond. But imagine that under duress, we force those children to cross their arms so that the bond between them is distorted and different. We're going to call that a trans double bond, a trans. And that's important because trans bonds, which occur in fatty acids, are the bonds that occur through chemical manipulation that we see in things like margarine. And trans-bonded fatty acids are the ones that we consider are just not good for our health. They're the ones that really seem to raise the bad cholesterol in the body and seem to be associated with worse outcomes. So trans-bonded unsaturated fatty acids are the ones that have different bonding between the carbon atoms. If you like, those arms cross over rather than remain parallel. Okay, so we've covered saturated fatty acids, mono unsaturated fatty acids with one double bond, and poly unsaturated fatty acids with more than one double bond occurring. What I'd like to do now is be a bit more specific about these fatty acids and give you some extra information about some of the words you will have heard, and I now want to put them into context so you understand what they mean. So let's be more specific. Let's take 16 children. The very last child we're going to give an orange ribbon to and ask them to hold it with with two hands, and we're going to give them a red ribbon wrapped around a hula hoop and ask them to hold it in one hand. So we've created a fatty acid with a double bond oxygen, single bond hydroxyl, and 16 children. We're going to start with a saturated 16 child fatty acid, so no double bonds, and we know this actually from our research is a fat because it at room temperature is in the solid form. We know this 16 carbon fatty acid that's saturated as animal fat, or the main component of animal fat that we see when we're chopping up our barbecue meat or getting our bacon ready. We call it a fat because it's solid at room temperature. So A fat is simply a solid at room temperature. Now, we do use abbreviations for saturated fatty acids, so you may hear them referred to as SFAs, saturated fatty acids. That's pretty straightforward. That 16 carbon fatty acid, saturated fatty acid that I just told you about, also has a organic chemistry name or a scientific name, and it's called palmitic acid. And you may hear that word in other contexts, and now you know what it is, palmitic acid. That is the 16-chain saturated fat that we know as animal fat, palmitic. Now, we're going to extend our chain of 16 children by 2. We're going to increase it to 18 children with the same last child with a double handhold to the orange ribbon, or a double handhold to oxygen, double bond to the oxygen, and a single bond to the hydroxyl group, or the single handhold holding a hula hoop and red ribbon. Except this time, with our 18 children and the same fatty acid ending, we are going to get the child at position 9 to double handhold with the child at position 10. That double handhold is a double bond, and because it's a double bond, and we're going to make sure it's the only double bond in that line of children, we now have created a 16-child monounsaturated fatty acid at position 9. Now, it turns out that there is nomenclature around that, and there's all sorts of words that we use to describe fatty acids that are like this, and I'm going to help you understand a little bit of that. But first of all, our monounsaturated 18-carbon fatty acid with the double bond at position 9, we know as the main component of olive oil. It is a monounsaturated fatty acid. M for mono, U for unsaturated, F for fatty, A for acid. The name of that acid is oleic acid, but it's the olive oil acid. Oh, sorry, it's the olive oil fatty acid. So, easy one to remember, perhaps, and you will have heard of oleic acid. The really nice thing about some of the nomenclature we use is that when we're using scientific terminology, we use the term omega to define where the very first double bond is in our fatty acid chain. So if I said to you, omega 9, then I would be telling you that the first double bond occurs at the 9th position. So our olive oil fatty acid, our oleic acid, is an omega 9 monounsaturated fatty acid that's 18 children long. I'm breaking this down because these are terms that you will have heard, and I just want you to get that they're actually not that complicated if you walk through them in a systematic and simple way. We're now going to take those 18 children and we're going to shift the double bonds within them. We're now going to get the child at position 6 to hold the child at position 7 with 2 hands, and we're going to get the child at position 9 to hold the child at position 10 with 2 hands. We've now gone from monounsaturated to 2 unsaturated bonds, 2 situations where 2 pairs of children, if you like, are double hand holding. We've now got a more than one polyunsaturated fatty acid with the first double bond at position 6. So it must be called an omega 6. polyunsaturated fatty acid. And because we were using 18 carbon chains or 18 children for our analogy as before, this particular fatty acid has a name. It's one that we would be familiar with as a vegetable oil, commonly from something like sunflower seeds, and it has the name linoleic acid. It is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. P for poly, U for unsaturated, F for fatty acid, F for fatty, A for acid, a puffer. And because that first double bond is at position 6, it's an omega-6 puffer. I'm guessing you've heard some of these words before, and I'm hoping that they're making a little bit of sense. Now we're going to take our 18 children, add 2 more children into the middle, and we're going to put a number of double bonds in there. Our first double bond is going to be between child 3 and 4. Our next double bond between child 6 and 7. Our next double bond between child 9 and 10, and then 12 and 13, and then 15 and 16. We now have 5 double bonds in this chain of 20 children, with the first double bond at position 3. So it's going to be called something omega-3. Omega-3. Well, guess what? This particular fatty acid we know as one of the main constituents of fish oil. Omega-3. And because it's polyunsaturated, because it's got multiple double bonds, more than one, it's poly. So we've got an omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid and omega-3 puffer. There is, in fact, a scientific name for that, and it is called eicosapentaenoic acid. You don't have to remember that unless you really want to. But omega-3, that's where it comes from. So we now have chains of saturated fatty acids, no double bonds. We have monounsaturated fatty acids, muffers. So only a single double bond. A bit like, well, like I just told you, like olive oil in actual fact. We have puffers, where omega defines where the first of those double bonds is, and puffers can be 2 or more double bonds within that chain. Remember that trans bonds, where there's a distortion in the connection between those carbon atoms, they're just not good for us, and we want to avoid those if at all possible. So we've spoken about the chain forms. I want to now circle back, and I'm using the term circle back deliberately because I want to talk about ring forms. So now we're going to think about our children in ring forms. And when we make our rings, we're going to make rings of 6 children. And we're going to put them together side by side. And what I particularly want to do is make 3 rings of 6 children and 1 ring of 5 children, and arrange them so that they're sort of next to each other and sort of sharing common walls. So they're sort of hexagon to hexagon to hexagon and pentagon. Now, if we take those 17 children, make 3 rings with 6 children, 3 rings of 6 children and 1 ring of 5 children, and then at one end, at the pentagon end, we hang a hydrocarbon chain, and at the first hexagon end, the very beginning of that structure, we put a hula hoop with a red ribbon. We take one of the hydrogen or hula hoops away from one of those children on the outside of that first ring, and we replace it with a hula hoop wrapped with an orange ribbon. We've now taken away a hydrogen atom and replaced it with a hydroxyl group. What we've created with those rings of 6 children plus the ring of 5 children is a steroid base. And that shape, that group of hydrocarbons in those ring forms in chemical speak is called a steroid base. And you will have heard of steroids, and it really relates to that formation. By adding a hydroxyl group to the end, by adding our, if you like, hula hoop with a red ribbon around it, we've turned that into an alcohol steroid. So, pretty straightforward. The reason why that's important is because one of the important compounds I want to talk about is cholesterol, and cholesterol is exactly that. It's based on a steroid platform with a hydroxyl or alcohol group attached. So now we're familiar with chains of children, fatty acid chains, if you like. So chains of children, and at one end they're holding a hydroxyl group, a hula hoop with a red ribbon around it, and a double handhold onto an orange ribbon. At the other end, so now we're familiar with our chains of children or chains of carbon atoms, and at one end they've got the double handhold for the orange ribbon or a double bond to oxygen and a single bond to a hula hoop plus red ribbon wrapped around it, or our hydroxyl group. We're also now familiar with ring structures, 3 rings of 6 children plus a ring of 5 children with a hydroxyl group or a hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it hanging off the first ring of 6. I want to bring your attention to the hula hoops with the red ribbons around them, these hydroxyl groups, because these become really important in the next stage of how the body deals with fatty acids and cholesterol. And I'm going to walk you through that nice and slowly. Remember our fatty acids, put them over to one side for a moment, and now we're going to create a slightly different structure with our children. We're going to take 3 children who consider themselves to be leaders of the pack. And those 3 children all want to stick together. All of those children also happen to have their own hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it. Each of those children has a hydroxyl group. So now imagine this, in a row, 3 children, 1, 2, 3. They're holding each other, one arm to one arm, so they're in a simple saturated bond, a single bond. They've got their hydrogen atoms hanging off in one direction, but all of them put their right arm, or one of their arms out, put their right arm out, and they're holding a hula hoop with a red ribbon around it. Now those 3 children are now going to stay together by hook or by crook. And in fact, if we were going to give them a name in organic chemistry, we would call them glycerol. Glycerol. You don't need to remember that, can if you like. But remember, these 3 children all stick together. Now each of those children are going to hold out their hula hoops with a red ribbon, and what they're trying to attract is the chains of children that we've talked about before, who at one end have a hula hoop with a red ribbon. They want to match those 2 components together. So imagine there are multiple chains of children in a playground, and we've got our 3 glycerol arranged children here, each holding out their hula hoops with a red ribbon. Well, with time, 3 different chains will come in to that group of 3 lead children, and those 3 chains will connect the hula hoop with a red ribbon to a hula hoop with a red ribbon on the 3 children in a row to the hula hoop and red ribbon end of the free fatty acid chain, or the children that are making up our free fatty acid chain. Now here's the deal. These hula hoops with the red ribbons can react together, and what our lead children want to do is grab the fatty acids by the hula hoop with red ribbon, so that by the time they finished, they are holding on to the fatty acid through the red ribbon alone. So as these hula hoops and red ribbons come together, one from the fatty acid, one from the glycerol group, they connect. What happens is 2 hula hoops drop out, 1 red ribbon drops out, and the remaining connection is between that orange ribbon being held by the child in the group of 3 and being held by the last child in the chain of the fatty acid chain. That occurs 3 times. And if that occurs 3 times for all 3 of those lead children, then we've now got a 3-glyceride, is what we call it, or triglyceride. We've now connected 3 fatty acids to these 3 lead children and created a complex lipid structure, a complex fat structure, a complex hydrocarbon structure that now can be used for transport and storage. Here's the interesting thing. As those hula hoop with ribbons came together from the fatty acid and from the glycerol group, and the 2 hula hoops dropped away and 1 red ribbon dropped away, you've probably figured it out already, but 2 H's plus an O is H2O. So each of those reactions forms 1 molecule of water. Wow, this stuff really works, eh? So we've now got our 3 lead children who are all connected together, now linked up with each of those holding their own fatty acid chain. The process where those hydroxyl groups came together to result in a connection between the oxygen atom and the release of H2O is called esterification. These fatty acids have been esterified. You don't necessarily need to remember that, but it is a term that does come up. Now, really important you remember that esterification is part of, in the triglycerides, formation of those 3 fatty acids all linked together, is part of the processes which we'll be talking about when we get to transport, storage, and then subsequent utilisation. Now, here's the other thing that's worth remembering. We talked about cholesterol having a hydroxyl group hanging off it as well. Cholesterol on one of the 6 rings having a, if you like, hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it. Well, guess what? That hula hoop with a red ribbon wrapped around it can interact with exactly the same fatty acids that our glycerol trio were able to interact with as well. So now our cholesterol's floating around in the playground. The child's holding out his hydroxyl group, his hula hoop with a red ribbon, and bumps into a fatty acid group of children, a chain of children with an end hydroxyl group as well. Now, that fatty acid group can be any number of things. It's often one called linolate, but it can also be one that we know as oleic acid, the one from olive oil. So cholesterol can also become esterified to those fatty acids that we spoke about. And again, that's part of a transport and storage process. Okay, pretty heavy stuff so far. I need to wind back momentarily and come back to our group of 3 leading children. This time I want to rearrange exactly what they do. They're going to stay in their chain of 3, their line of 3. They've all still got the same hula hoops, red ribbons hanging off one side. This time, out of the 3 children, 2 of them obtain a fatty acid chain of other children to link up with them, but the 3rd child at either end puts their hula hoop with a red ribbon, their hydroxyl group out, and that interacts on this occasion with a phosphate molecule, a phosphate compound. And that creates what you will hear called a phospholipid. Imagine a P, if you like, P for phospho, or if you like, P for parent, hanging off those 3 children instead of the fatty acid. The third fatty acid being replaced by P for a parent. Well, what do parents do? They allow a different way of behaviour. And the really important thing with phospholipids is that that end of that lipid complex, of that fatty hydrocarbon complex, that end of it is actually water soluble. It interacts with water. So these compounds can have a head, their phosphate head, their parental head, sticking into the water, and they can have their remaining components within areas where there's no water. For example, within a cell membrane where it's fatty. Really interesting and really important to understand, because we do need to think about whether things dissolve in water or not. So putting a phosphate into a triglyceride, which is really now a biglyceride, putting a phosphate into that allows it some ability to interact with water and not repel water. Well, remember, I think a nice way to think of it is that our children are all wearing raincoats because they've got sensible parents. And so those raincoats, if you like, repel water. They stop water really dissolving those structures. And the other thing to remember is hydrocarbons, just by the way they're structured, are less dense than water, so they float. Well, why is that important? Remember, it's important because if we think about cream in milk, cream floats to the surface, which means if we had our fatty acids floating around in our body and they're not soluble and they're less dense than water, if we stood for any moment of time, if we stood for long enough, then you've guessed it, all those fatty acids would gradually float to the highest point in our body, and eventually our heads would be clogged with fatty acids all floating around in our blood vessels of our brains. It's just like cream in milk. Of course, that doesn't happen, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that because the body has created fantastic special carrier mechanisms, these really clever little spherical capsules that carry fat around the body to put it exactly where we need it and get around that problem of fat not interacting with water and floating to the surface, which would be a disaster for us. While I'm on that though, I can give you a definition. So we've talked about hydrocarbons, we've talked about fats, which are really, if you like, these fatty acid structures that are solid at room temperature. We've talked about oils, which are fatty acids, which are liquid at room temperature. And one of the other words I want to cover is a word called lipids. Lipids. Well, lipids really relate to the compounds that are not water soluble, the compounds that need special solvent to dissolve them. In the body, in our bodies, I really want to limit that to fatty acids, free fatty acids. I want to limit it to triglycerides, cholesterol and cholesterol esters. And if you can stick with that, then that'll really help you understand where lipids are. And it's really the term that we tend to use for these hydrocarbons which have been modified in the way that I'm talking about within the body. So, I'm going to summarise now, and I hope this works for you. I'd really like you to think of carbon atoms as children with 4 arms. A bit peculiar, but it's an easy thing to visualise, particularly if you're looking down on them. As they connect with each other, they can do so with one arm or more than one arm, single bond or a double bond, and they can do it in chains or they can do it in ring forms. If they connect one arm to one arm and their spare hands have to hold something and they're holding as many hula hoops as possible or hydrogen atoms, then we call those saturated. If in our chain or in our ring of hydrocarbon, there's a pair of carbon atoms using two hands to hold each other. We call that unsaturated. If it occurs once, monounsaturated. If it occurs more than once, polyunsaturated. Remember, most of those saturated bonds, those unsaturated bonds, most of those double bonds are going to be cis, natural connections between two carbon atoms. Trans means we've got an abnormal or a forced connection, which is just not ideal. It comes from often chemical manipulation. When we take our hydrocarbons and we add in our orange ribbon or oxygen, that oxygen can be in isolation, held by the children, or in combination with a hula hoop or a hydrogen atom. So we now add in to our chains an oxygen held with two hands and a hydroxyl group, oxygen and hydrogen together, in our last child to form a free fatty acid or a fatty acid chain. We also can add that hydroxyl group to the first ring of our four-ring structure, which is our steroid base, to make a steroid alcohol. And that is really our starting point for cholesterol. These HO groups, these hydrogen, oxygen, these hula hoops with a red ribbon wrapped around them, are the point where the fatty acids can interact and connections can be made. The process is one called esterification. And that esterification can occur if we've got three carbons in a row that are all holding hydroxyl groups. We can attach three fatty acids and make a triglyceride. If we've got a cholesterol moiety, a cholesterol with a OH hanging off it, we can connect a fatty acid to that and make a cholesterol ester. We can also take our three carbon atoms, our three children, who are our leaders, connect two fatty acids, and at the end, instead of the third fatty acid, connect a phosphate group and create a phospholipid, a compound that has qualities which allow it to interact with water at one end, but also be insoluble in water at the other. So, that was a big lot of stuff to cover. I hope it's made some sense. I have tried to cover hydrocarbons, fats, oils, and lipids. I will come back and talk about how we move all that stuff around the body, because that is really important. But I can't describe that until we've covered this first part. I hope that you've got a better understanding of what these terms mean: fatty acids, muffers, puffers, SFAs, double bonds. I hope it makes a bit of sense. I hope you even understand a bit more about cholesterol. You don't need to remember esterification, but you do need to understand that our body deals with these compounds in a way to best utilise them for transport and for storage, and esterification is part of that. I'm going to wrap it up there because it's been a huge one. I am, as always, going to wish you the very best. If you have any queries or questions, please let me know. If you've got any suggestions for future presentations, again, also let me know. I'm going to say goodbye, and as always, I wish you the very best health, and please don't die from a heart attack. Goodbye.
You have been listening to another podcast from Dr. Warrick. Visit his website at drwarrickbishop.com for the latest news on heart disease. If you love this podcast, feel free to leave us a review.